Jessica Brooks lived a life shaped by worn routines and soft, unseen sacrifices. At 28, she existed quietly between the cracked sidewalks of Elm Creek and the faded walls of Misty Baker's Cafe, a place as weathered as the old railway station it sat beside. Every morning began the same, the sharp cry of her alarm at 4:45 a.m., the careful braiding of her hair in front of a cracked mirror, the tightening of frayed laces on the same scuffed black shoes she had worn since the cafe's grand reopening 4 years earlier. She moved through these moments without thinking, each one stitched to the next like patches in an old quilt. The town around her had long since surrendered to the slow decay of time. Elm Creek had once been a bustling stopover for travelers and traders, its main street lined with diners, boutiques, and two-story homes trimmed with white-painted fences. But when the bypass highway came through and the mega supermarket rose on the outskirts, Elm Creek's veins thinned. Buildings emptied. Paint peeled from forgotten porches. Signs sagged under rusted chains. Misty Baker's, with its old oak booths and faded red curtains, clung stubbornly to life. The cafe smelled always of brewing coffee and baking bread, as if memory alone could sustain it. Jessica had worked there for nearly 4 years, long enough to know every squeak of the swinging kitchen door, every stubborn burner on the ancient stove. Her days blurred together, endless cups of black coffee poured for the few loyal customers who still believed in small-town familiarity, silent hours spent wiping counters that didn't need cleaning, refilling salt shakers worn smooth by countless hands. She rarely spoke of her life outside the cafe, though the signs were there for anyone who cared enough to look. The way she glanced anxiously at her old flip phone after every shift, checking for messages from her sister's school or doctor. The way her smile faltered whenever talk turned to weekend trips or family vacations, things she hadn't known in years. The careful way she folded each dollar bill from her tips, placing them in a worn leather pouch she carried instead of a purse. Above the pharmacy where she rented a one-room apartment, her world was even smaller. A narrow bed, a battered desk covered in overdue notices, and the sound of her sister's soft breathing from the mattress beside hers. In that small, dim room, Jessica counted every cent, every pill, every blessing. She had no margin for error. No space for dreams. Only duty. The last true luxury she allowed herself was a battered thermos of coffee she filled every morning before leaving the cafe, warming her hands against its metal sides as she walked the gray streets. It was a small rebellion, a reminder that there were still simple pleasures even when everything else had slipped beyond her grasp. Lately, even Misty Baker's had begun to feel heavier around her, like a ship taking on water. Customers were fewer. Mrs. Hudson, the cafe's owner, kept a closer eye on the inventory sheets pinned above the sink. "No waste," she said sharply once, after Jessica had thrown away a burnt batch of muffins. "Everything costs money." Jessica understood. She understood too well the cost of everything, the fragile balance of survival. It clung to her shoulders every hour she was awake. She missed being seen not just as a pair of working hands, but as someone whole. Someone whose life stretched beyond the narrow borders of obligation. There were days when she would catch her reflection in the cafe's front window and barely recognize herself, the woman with tired eyes and careful steps, who spoke always in polite tones and laughed just a little too quickly when customers joked. She had dreams once. Not grand ones. Nothing that would have earned a headline or a scholarship. Just small hopes, studying childhood education at the community college, volunteering at the library, maybe someday buying a second-hand car that didn't shudder every time it started. She had imagined a life filled with color and conversation, simple happiness rooted in steady ground. Those dreams had faded after the accident. After the endless months of paperwork, of grief packaged into hospital forms and court dates, after the guardianship papers arrived bearing her name and her sister's fate in heavy legal font. There hadn't been room for dreams after that, only plans. Only survival. Still, despite the monotony, Jessica found a quiet strength in her days. There was something sacred about showing up when no one expected anything from you. Something heroic in folding napkins perfectly, in memorizing how each customer liked their coffee, and offering warmth in small and invisible ways. Every day she chose to continue. And every day, that choice cost her more than anyone could see. Some mornings, while scrubbing stubborn stains from the tabletops, she imagined the cafe as a ship sailing through fog, half forgotten by the world but still afloat, still moving forward. She told herself she was the anchor, keeping it from drifting away altogether. Yet lately, even that anchor felt heavier. The balance sheet in the office grew more desperate. Mrs. Hudson's frown deepened with each slow lunch hour. The gas heater clicked hesitantly now, struggling against the October chill that crept through the building's thin walls. Jessica learned to layer sweaters under her uniform, to breathe through the aching cold, to hold herself together with sheer will. And always, at the edges of her mind, the fears waited. Would she lose this job too? Would the rent finally fall overdue beyond salvation? Would she have to choose between medicine and meals? The thought that frightened her most was one she barely allowed herself to whisper. What if one day, showing up wouldn't be enough? Still, she pressed on. Still, she wiped the counters, tied her apron, offered small smiles to weary customers. Still, she believed, somehow, stubbornly, that kindness mattered. Even if no one saw it. Even if it changed nothing. Because kindness, she thought, was like the old oak counter in Misty Baker's, worn, battered, scratched by years of use, but still standing. Still holding up the world, one cup of coffee at a time. It was a Tuesday evening when Jessica noticed him again. The night air had turned sharp, carrying the first real bite of approaching winter. The neon sign in Misty Baker's window buzzed quietly, flickering between open and ope, as if even the sign itself struggled to hold on. Inside, the cafe was nearly empty, save for two old men playing chess in the corner and a young mother nursing a coffee as her toddler colored restlessly. Jessica moved between the tables, refilling cups, straightening salt shakers, cleaning already clean surfaces with a cloth worn nearly translucent at the edges. Her steps were automatic, her mind a low hum of worries about the grocery list, the heating bill, the new refill notice for her sister's asthma medication tucked inside her apron pocket. It was when she stepped outside with the trash that she saw him. Across the narrow, cracked street sat an elderly man, hunched against the freezing wind, perched on the cold metal bench of the abandoned bus stop. His army jacket was worn thin at the elbows, the fabric darkened with years of use. His hands, bare and trembling, were clasped tightly together. His boots were scuffed to ruin. Jessica recognized him. He had been in the cafe a few times before, always ordering the smallest coffee, sipping it slowly as if willing it to last forever. He never stayed past the acceptable hours, never made a fuss, never asked for anything more. Some of the other staff rolled their eyes when he entered, muttering about loiterers and bad appearances. Mrs. Hudson had even suggested, with a tight-lipped smile, that they serve him quickly so he might move along faster. Jessica had never minded him. There was something in the way he sat, shoulders folded inward, gaze lowered, that reminded her of the scared, stubborn girl she had once been. Someone used to asking for as little as possible, knowing that even kindness came with a price you might not afford. Tonight, though, he wasn't sipping coffee. He wasn't inside, where the thin warmth of the radiators still struggled against the chill. He was out there, teeth chattering, hands blue, the light dust of snow beginning to settle onto his thin coat like sorrow descending from the sky. Jessica hesitated, the cold biting through her thin uniform. Rules. Always the rules. Mrs. Hudson's voice rang sharply in her mind, no giveaways, no charity, no encouraging vagrancy. The inventory had to be accounted for. Every bowl of soup, every crust of bread, cost money the cafe could barely spare. She could already hear the reprimand if anyone found out. But then she thought of her sister's face, the way it pinched in pain during an asthma attack, how Jessica had once begged a pharmacist to accept 10 crumpled dollars for a medication bottle that cost 3 times that. And she thought, too, of the elderly man's hands, raw and red, clenching each other not out of comfort but out of desperation. The decision was made without ceremony. Jessica returned inside, her hands moving swiftly but carefully. In the back kitchen, she gathered what she could, 2 soft rolls left over from the lunch service, a bowl of hot soup, still steaming on the back burner, a piece of apple pie from the cracked tray that wouldn't sell tomorrow anyway. She wrapped the rolls in a napkin, ladled the soup into a disposable container, packed it all into a small paper bag. She moved quickly, heart pounding, every step feeling both dangerous and necessary. She left a small stack of coins from her own tip jar beside the register, enough, she hoped, to cover the missing portions. Jessica slipped out the side door and crossed the street, her breath clouding the air in front of her. The man didn't look up until she knelt in front of him, placing the warm paper bag carefully at his feet. He blinked, dazed, as if unsure whether she was real or some trick of the wind. His eyes, deep-set and tired, met hers for a brief moment, and in that second, the world seemed to still. No words passed between them. None were needed. Jessica offered a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of humanity, and turned back toward the cafe. Behind her, the man reached out slowly, reverently, as if the paper bag were a holy thing. She told herself it was nothing. A small thing. One meal, one night. Tomorrow he would still be cold. Still alone. The world would still turn, indifferent and vast. But she also knew, deep in her bones, that sometimes the small things were the only real things left. Inside Misty Baker's, the fluorescent lights hummed harshly overhead. Mrs. Hudson emerged from the back room, clipboard in hand, frown etched deep into her lined face. She paused, sniffing the air. Something in her gaze sharpened when she noticed Jessica slipping off her coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Jessica kept her head down, moving back to the counter, wiping down surfaces that didn't need it, pretending nothing had happened. Pretending she was still invisible. But something had shifted. Not in the cafe, not in Mrs. Hudson's ledger books or the dwindling customer counts. In Jessica herself. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had acted not from duty, not from fear, not because someone expected it of her. She had acted from simple, stubborn compassion. It was a fragile feeling, like a flame cupped between trembling hands. But it burned brightly enough to warm her fingers as she finished her shift, as she locked up the cafe and stepped into the bitter wind once again. Across the street, the old man was gone. Only the paper bag remained, crumpled and empty on the frozen bench. And Jessica, walking home alone under the falling snow, felt something new settle into her heart, a quiet certainty that sometimes doing the right thing mattered, even when no one saw it, even when it cost more than you could afford. Especially then. The morning after Jessica's quiet rebellion dawned brittle and gray. The frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the cafe's windows, turning the view outside into a foggy watercolor of skeletal trees and cracked sidewalks. The air inside Misty Baker's felt no warmer, even as the heaters sputtered their weak protests against the cold. Jessica arrived 10 minutes early, as she always did. Habit, not hope, pulled her through the door. She unwound her scarf, carefully hung her coat on the bent hook behind the counter, and set about prepping the morning urns of coffee. The comforting clatter of mugs and silverware usually soothed her nerves. Today, though, everything felt sharper, more brittle. She caught Mrs. Hudson watching her from the office doorway, eyes narrowed. Jessica turned back to polishing a tray of silverware, the back of her neck prickling with unease. It wasn't long before Mrs. Hudson called her name. The voice was clipped, official. Jessica wiped her hands on her apron and followed. The office smelled of cold coffee and paper dust. Mrs. Hudson sat behind the battered desk, tapping a pen against a clipboard with small, impatient clicks. Without preamble, she placed a sheet of paper between them, a formal termination notice. Jessica felt the world tilt slightly. "You used company property for personal charity," Mrs. Hudson said, her words stripped of warmth. "We have inventory procedures for a reason. If we start handing out free food, we'll be out of business before winter's done." Jessica opened her mouth, the protest rising instinctively, but she closed it again without speaking. She thought of the soup she had ladled, the coins she had left, the careful calculations made in the quiet hope of causing no harm. And she realized none of that mattered now. The decision had already been made. Mrs. Hudson slid a small manila envelope across the desk, her final paycheck, clipped and neat, the ink still wet on the numbers. "We expect professionalism here," she added. If we made exceptions for every sad story, this town would bleed us dry. Jessica nodded once, numbly. She removed her apron, folding it carefully before placing it on the desk. She collected her few personal items, a chipped thermos, a small notepad, the faded photo of her and her sister tucked behind the service counter. The bell above the cafe door jingled as she left, but this time there was no warmth in it. Only the hollow clang of finality. Outside, the cold was immediate and merciless. Jessica pulled her scarf tighter, tucking her chin against the wind, and began the long walk home. Each step was heavier than the last. Without her job, she knew the calculations she lived by would no longer hold. There was no cushion. No backup plan. Rent. Utilities. Medication. The ledger of her life was inked only in debts and duties. By the time she reached her apartment, her hands were numb, and her heart ached with a deep, marrow-deep weariness. She climbed the narrow stairs to her one-room world, where the radiators hissed and coughed without conviction. Her sister, Anna, still asleep beneath a mountain of patched quilts, stirred faintly at the sound of Jessica's arrival. Jessica sat down heavily at the tiny kitchen table. She spread out the bills in front of her with mechanical precision, her breath leaving small puffs of condensation in the freezing air. Even without doing the math, she knew. There was no way through this time. Her thoughts circled like trapped birds. Should she call the landlord and beg for an extension? Should she plead with the pharmacist again, spinning careful lies about checks that hadn't yet arrived? Should she sell the battered truck she barely used, even though it was their only means to get Anna to the clinic during emergencies? She sat there for a long time, motionless except for the quiet trembling of her hands. Somewhere in the room, the old clock ticked steadily on, marking the slow, indifferent passage of time. By the next morning, word had spread through Elm Creek. Misty Baker's was small. Elm Creek was smaller. There were no secrets in towns like this, only stories that grew in the retelling, like vines winding around a crumbling wall. At the corner store, Mr. Douglas frowned over his newspaper and muttered about wasteful behavior when he heard the tale. At the post office, Mrs. Green shook her head and said it was sad, sure, but rules were rules. At the barber shop, the regulars joked bitterly about how Charity didn't pay the electric bill. Jessica's name hung in the air like smoke, not in outrage or sympathy, but in quiet, resigned dismissal. Just another young woman who hadn't understood how the real world worked. Jessica knew better than to expect help. She had grown up in Elm Creek's shadow, understood the cold economy of its kindness, given sparingly, withdrawn swiftly. Still, a part of her had hoped, foolishly, stubbornly, that someone would understand. That someone would see the heart behind the mistake. But no one called. No one knocked. No one even looked her in the eye at the market when she went in to buy the cheapest groceries she could find. The town moved on. The world, as always, turned without her. Jessica spent the next days searching for work, walking door to door in the thinning light, filling out applications with hands that ached from the cold and heart that ached from something deeper. No one was hiring. The only factory left in town had frozen new positions. The grocery store manager shook his head without even glancing at her resume. She returned home each evening with empty pockets and raw, frozen hope. Each night, after Anna fell asleep, Jessica would sit at the kitchen table and run the numbers again. Each time, the outcome was the same, impossible. Still, she stayed. Still, she showed up to each desperate new day. Because if she gave up, who would be left to keep the small promises that stitched her life together? On the third morning, a cold rain fell. Jessica bundled Anna for school, tucked the last of their bread into her lunchbox, and sent her off with a kiss and a wavering smile. She stood at the window long after Anna had disappeared into the misty gray. The town blurred behind the raindrops sliding down the glass. It was then that she saw them. A procession of black vehicles, moving slowly down Main Street, their dark, gleaming shapes utterly out of place against the sagging buildings and shuttered shops. At first, Jessica thought it might be a funeral, a dignitary's passing, perhaps. But then she noticed the flags. The official plates. The small cluster of suited men moving swiftly through the rain. They weren't stopping at the mayor's office. They weren't headed toward the courthouse. They were pulling up directly in front of Misty Baker's cafe. Jessica's heart stuttered once, hard enough to leave her breathless. Something was happening. Something that would soon sweep her carefully measured life into a storm she never saw coming. Jessica stood frozen at the window, her fingers pressed lightly against the cold glass. The black cars gleamed under the misting rain, their engines idling like distant thunder. Uniformed men in heavy coats stepped out first, followed by aides in sharp suits and glossy shoes that looked ill-suited for Elm Creek's cracked sidewalks. At the center of it all was a tall figure, his presence unmistakable even from a distance. Governor Charles Gray, a man whose image had graced countless news stories, debates, and town halls. His reputation was one of service and integrity, a rare thing these days. Jessica blinked, half convinced she was imagining it. The townspeople were gathering now, drawn like moths to a sudden flame. Shop owners leaned out their doorways. Students on their way to school paused mid-step. Even Mrs. Hudson emerged from Misty Baker's, smoothing her apron and pasting on a practiced smile. Jessica hesitated only a moment before grabbing her coat and slipping out into the street, hard hammering. By the time she joined the crowd, the governor was already speaking, his voice steady and resonant despite the rain. He thanked Elm Creek for its service to the state, for its enduring spirit. Polite applause scattered across the small crowd. Mrs. Hudson beamed at the mention of Misty Baker's, standing a little straighter as if soaking in the reflected praise. But then Governor Gray paused, scanning the faces gathered before him. His expression shifted, from practiced warmth to something sharper, something searching. He raised a hand, and the aide stepped aside. From one of the black vehicles emerged the elderly man Jessica had helped, though he stood straighter now, his uniform freshly pressed, the medals on his chest gleaming beneath the cloudy sky. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Governor Gray stepped closer to the man, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. This town, he said, voice carrying over the rain, was part of an initiative. A quiet one. My father, retired General Arthur Gray, volunteered to walk among everyday citizens, not as a hero, but as a man in need. To see who would treat him not for his title, but for his humanity. The weight of his words sank slowly into the gathered crowd. A few people exchanged uncertain glances. Mrs. Hudson's smile faltered. Among all the places he visited, Governor Gray continued, only one person acted without expectation, without recognition. Only one showed kindness when they thought no one was watching. A young woman who gave freely, despite her own hardships. Who acted with simple, unspoken decency. Jessica felt the air rush from her lungs. The governor turned, his eyes meeting hers across the crowd. Jessica Brooks, he said, his voice gentler now, almost reverent. You reminded us what honor looks like when no one demands it. You showed that dignity isn't found in titles or uniforms, but in the quiet choices we make for one another. The crowd shifted, people parting as aides motioned Jessica forward. She moved slowly, as if through water, each step dreamlike and heavy. When she reached him, Governor Gray extended a small, polished wooden box. Inside, resting against dark velvet, was a medal, simple, understated, engraved with the words for quiet valor. The governor handed her the box, then withdrew a letter sealed with the state's insignia. We would like you, he said, to serve as the first coordinator for our new program, Care in Every Home. A support initiative for veterans across the state, starting right here, in towns like Elm Creek. Jessica's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. She barely heard the rest, something about salary, about benefits, about honor, over the roaring in her ears. She saw, over the governor's shoulder, Mrs. Hudson standing pale and still, the clipboard in her hand sagging at her side. She saw the faces of her neighbors, once disinterested, now stricken with a mix of shame and awe. But Jessica wasn't thinking of them. She was thinking of Anna, of the heating bill folded on the kitchen table, of the quiet, desperate prayers she had sent up into the cold air when no one had been listening. She was thinking of how a single act of kindness, unremarkable, unreported, had unfolded into something larger than she had dared to imagine. 3 months later, Jessica stood again in front of the old railway station, now transformed into Elm Creek's first Veterans Support Center. The oak benches had been polished, the cracked bricks mended. New banners fluttered in the crisp spring wind, their colors bright against the pale sky. Children played nearby. Veterans and families gathered inside, sharing coffee, sharing stories, sharing hope. Jessica wore a simple navy dress and a silver pin, the same words engraved on it as her medal, Quiet Valor. General Arthur Gray sat in the front row, his hands folded carefully in his lap, pride clear in his lined face. Governor Gray took the podium but spoke briefly. The true honor, he said, belonged not to the powerful, but to those who chose goodness when it cost them the most. As the ribbon fell away and the center officially opened, Jessica felt something inside her lift, not in grand fanfare, but in quiet, steady certainty. Change wasn't made in sweeping gestures or grand speeches. It was made in a paper bag of soup on a cold night. In a battered cafe. In a heart stubborn enough to choose kindness over fear. The townspeople who had once looked through her now stood quietly to the side, their faces soft with understanding. Jessica met their gazes and smiled, not in triumph but in simple, abiding peace. Because kindness without question had been enough. It had always been enough. And finally, the world had remembered.